Our next speaker is somebody that you recognize as a very prominent face in Canadian media as a journalist. But I came to know of him because my dad is a big fan of watching The National. Back when Nilton Nash, is that how you pronounce it? Or was it Knowlton Nash? Knowlton. Okay, see, I was a kid. I was like, that guy is old. But he was always this familiar face that you went to the news. And then there was this other face. I'm like, hey, he looks like us. Because back then, there were no brown people on TV. And I'm just realizing this right now. And so that I'm brown, yes. Oh my God, it's a revelation. It started with Gabrielle talking, and then now I'm like, oh my God, Ian, I just figured this out. No, but it's true that when I first saw him, it was very important that back then, our community wasn't represented. And now he's gone on to be a prominent face, being a reporter for The National, a host of CBC News Now on The National, Pacific Rim Report, covering the Olympics. In 2008, he won the Gemini for Best News Anchor for presenting the stories that he does. But there's other facets to him that you may not know, and I did not know this. He's a big sports fan, plays ball hockey every Saturday morning at UBC. He put out a game, Big League Manager, NHL license. So it's like a real thing, not just like I just made a game and I put it out there and it's on eBay. No, it is licensed by NHL. He's got a board game out there. He's also got a funny side. When this hour has 22 minutes, the comedian Sean Majumdar took to making impersonations of him. Ian returned the favor by doing an impersonation of Sean Majumdar. You should check it out. You brought out your street flavor. It was pretty impressive. But I do have a question now. Now you have to tell me. You have to start. We haven't spoken about this, so if you get mad, it's too late because it's in front of everybody.
I'm not afraid at all. Go ahead.
Well, I didn't realize what an impact you had until somebody had actually, and now it's like seems to be common knowledge, and everyone can't help it. They can't help it. But handsome man thing. How do you feel about that?
Now that's an awkward question. I'll address it in my 20 minutes.
Okay, good, because I have some questions about that. So I won't delve into that because I want to hear about this. Because when I Googled it, you come up. So that's pretty awesome. But that's not the only reason why people love Ian. The way he delivers stories and his unique perspectives on social events, current affairs, and global issues is what made him popular as a media personality and on the platform. So let's bring him up here. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Hanomansing.
Thank you very much. So I should check and make sure that this microphone is working. Is it working? Good. Okay, because didn't get a chance to test that. So that was, one of the most generous and perhaps weirdest introductions I've ever had. So thank you, I guess. You in grade 9 hosted a show, Arsenio Tall. I obviously never did because I'm not as tall as you may have thought I was if you've only seen me on television. But the CBC does a very good job of trying to make me seem better than I actually am, and that's why the nickname is particularly awkward because on television I look taller. And through the magic of Photoshop, we have somebody back at CBC who's crazy for Photoshop. And I keep saying to them, you have to let me age in the publicity pictures. But no, they just keep playing with it the whole time. And so I just see myself get thinner and younger before my eyes. So this is the way I really look, not that way, and certainly not that way. So, the nickname, especially those of you who are tweeting, the nickname may end right now. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I speak to audiences, there are a few different topics that I speak about. I grew up in a little town, Sackville, New Brunswick. I lived there till I was 22 years old. And I don't know if this is an experience that you shared, but throughout my childhood, when people would ask me, where are you from? I would say Sackville, and then they would say, where are you really from? And I would say, no, I'm really from Sackville, but it took a few years for people to actually appreciate that. So sometimes I talk about my background and growing up in that little New Brunswick town that I very much still consider to be my hometown. I was just back there about a month ago. I sometimes speak about the Olympics. Tomorrow, CBC makes its announcement on its broadcast team, and I'll be one of the people going to Sochi. It'll be my 7th Olympic Games, and it really gives you an insight as a reporter, as a host, going to the Olympics, an insight what it's like, not just what you see as a spectator, but also what you see behind the scenes. So particularly in Vancouver and Calgary, but even more generally, the Olympics is something that gets a tremendous amount of attention, especially the Winter Olympics, and I like to talk about that. I have a law degree and have spent a lot of time covering a lot of different court cases, from O.J. Simpson in the United States to being in courtrooms right across Canada, and have some very strong opinions about what I see as a lack of openness in the court system, even though there are a lot of judges and lawyers who believe that it's important that justice be seen to be done. I have lots of examples of where I think they're falling short and the importance of changing that. But the topic that I talk about the most, not surprisingly, given my experience as a reporter, it's been more than 25 years. That's why I'm now at the stage in my career where it's people's parents and grandparents who know who I am, not so much the people themselves. Because clearly you've never seen me on television, I could tell. You Googled me yesterday, and that's basically...
I've watched a couple of pieces.
but that's good. I appreciate the fact that you did the Google search, and you nailed it. You even had the board game, which was very impressive. Very Oprah-like of you, let me say. And by the way, speaking of the various presentations that we've heard, in the news business, we're constantly trying to improve our ratings and trying to find some kind of new thing that attracts audiences. It might be something as simple as new animation or music. Obviously, always looking for stories, but I don't know if Roman is still here, but that improv thing with somebody behind me actually being my arms during the newscast, that would nail it. That would be so good.
Right?
Excellent. Yes, you could. I do a primetime show on CBC News Network, which is what we used to call News World. It's on at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and then there are a couple of other hours where we do live newscasts later on in the day, 7 p.m. Pacific Time and then 10 p.m. Pacific Time, and we cover a lot of stories. And yesterday, and it kind of fits into what we were talking about in the introduction, one of my guests, I got to interview Miss America. It's a nice part of this job that Miss America was the person. And it's kind of a shameless attempt at having somebody who's extraordinarily attractive on the air. But there was a kind of flimsy news premise as well. She happens to be the first Miss America of South Asian descent. And when she was selected, she did a Bollywood dance as her talent. You can imagine how that went over in Middle America. Not great. And so there was a barrage of tweets, a lot of them really racist and offensive. And it shouldn't surprise us in one way, because Twitter has become, there are a lot of useful things about Twitter, but it's also very easy to be obviously anonymous, and it doesn't take a lot of courage to go out and say something. And so she's been remarkable in the last month with the way that she's dealt with that. And obviously it's not a sentiment that would be new to her, but the onslaught of fame from being Miss America and the kind of reaction she got is relatively new. I was timidly looking at my Twitter account last night because I was expecting to get a lot of criticism about having Miss America on the news, on CBC News Network. Why would we have something as trivial as Miss America on a serious newscast? And actually, people didn't respond last night. They were so busy talking about Mike Duffy in the Senate, and we did get lots of tweets about that no one seemed particularly concerned about our interview with Miss America. Maybe they just enjoyed it. Plus, she's very bright and very interesting, and a very appealing guest to have. But one of the things that I run into, and I don't know if you run into it, is even as someone who's worked in this business for 25 years, will watch a newscast or read the newspaper and shake my head, or sometimes yell at the screen. I don't know if you do that. Even if you don't literally do it, I'm sure you metaphorically do it. And one of the things I like to talk to people about is an insider's view to why we make the decisions that we do when it comes to news. And particularly enjoy answering questions about that in a fairly candid way, because there are a lot of myths about the news. And in the time that I have, I'm just going to deal with sort of three of the big ones. One of the things that I hear over and over again is that negative news sells newspapers, improves ratings, that somehow people love misery, and that's why you see so much negative news on the air. There has to be a reason for it. There is. I'll get to it in a sec. But it absolutely is not because people like negative news. And think about it for a moment. Do you like turning on the television and hearing about despair and misery and bad things happening to other people? Of course not. And do you know anybody like that? I mean, you probably have some, crazy uncle who seems to enjoy the suffering of the rest of the family at Thanksgiving. But other than him, and we all have that uncle, clearly you have that uncle, other than him, really, we don't know people who revel in the despair of others. So that's not the reason we do it. In fact, in our market research, focus groups and surveys, but particularly focus groups, the single criticism we hear of television news time and again is that it is too negative. And increasingly we hear from people who say they have unplugged and turned off because they're tired of seeing all of this news that makes them feel worse. So we're very aware that not only does it not sell our product, but it actually hurts it. So then you're probably wondering, why is there so much negative news on the air? This happened to me on Saturday when usually on Saturdays, partially because I'm playing ball hockey in the morning and also spending time with my family in the afternoon. It's the one day of the week where I do kind of unplug from the media, because all through the week, like a lot of you, but especially in my business, I'm inundated with information from my smartphone, from the computer, from the bank of television monitors in our newsroom. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was in the car on Saturday. I turned on the radio. First story is about a murder. Second story is about a car crash on Highway 1. Third story was about a fire. And I think to myself, my goodness, of all the things happening in Metro Vancouver, this was a local station I was listening to, is that what's in the news? Well, the reason you hear those negative stories is that the news is, by definition, about what is unusual. If you turned on the National tonight and saw Peter Mansbridge and he started talking to you about how 1,400 planes took off and landed safely across Canada today, you'd look a little perplexed. If you heard that there wasn't a single fatality on the Trans-Canada Highway once again today, you'd be going, this is bizarro world. Why is this news? That the drinking water is safe in every major city across Canada yet again. Peter, nice, charming smile on his face. Well, of course, that's what we expect in this society. We live in a country, with exceptions, but generally speaking, which is safe and orderly, peace, order, and good government, the stirring words that we live by in Canada. So we do the news on what is unusual. We assume that our audience, to an extent, although people don't like negative news, are turning it on to listen to what is out of the ordinary, what is different. And we're lucky enough to live in a country where usually that means that the stories you hear are of things that go wrong. You as consumers of news need to understand that that is not an accurate snapshot of what happened today in Vancouver or in Canada. It is, I suppose, technically a distortion, but not a distortion done for ratings, not a distortion done for any malicious reason, but a distortion because we are, by definition in the news business, telling you what is happening out of the ordinary. Although there is a lesson in there for us, and it's a lesson I think you'll see in newscasts and in newspapers, is that we have to broaden our focus a little bit. Like, frankly, that's one of the reasons why we did interview Miss America last night. I don't think 10 years ago we would have done that on CBC News World. It would have seemed unimportant. But my view is, I use the metaphor quite often of an hour-long newscast, and I think it's true for a newspaper as well, of being like a meal. You don't just want meat and potatoes. I mean, we could package the nutrition of your daily information in a way that would be bland, that would have just the absolute news nutrients you need, but no color, no taste, no appetizer. You could do that. You could get this injection of news every day for a while, but I think after a while, you would choose to go somewhere else where you do get more than just meat and potatoes. And that's what we try to do in the newscast. And I think it's important for us to broaden our focus, but it's also important for consumers to understand that what you're seeing there is never meant to be, in a newscast, an accurate picture of what happened in the day, because we are fortunate enough to have a country and live in communities where most of our day things work out in a pretty routine way. Second big myth I want to talk about is the idea that somehow there are these corrupting influences in the way news decisions are made. Often you'll hear it has to do with advertisers, or in the case of the CBC as a public broadcaster, the government. That somehow what's happening in the boardroom is affecting what's happening in the newsroom. I can tell you that's not true, but of course, if there was a conspiracy, I wouldn't be able to tell you anyway, so you just have to trust me on this. I mean, one way to see that there is no impact from advertisers or the government in the coverage that the various media do is to see how similar that coverage is. If you look at Global National and CTV and CBC National last night, for example, and I took a look at the transcripts of all three, of course, all three led with the Senate story. The kinds of things they covered were very similar. The reason for that is every news organization I know is influenced more than anything else, not by ratings, not by focus groups, not by sponsors, but rather a series of meetings during the day where senior editorial leaders sit down around a table and try to figure out that balance between what's important and what's interesting. That's a difficult balance because lots of times we go in there and we say, you know what, there's a trial going on that is about some arcane constitutional issue, and we know it's not the kind of thing that's going to grab people by the lapels and make them excited, but we need to do that story. But you have to be really careful about that, because if you turn news into Buckley's cough syrup and you say, you know what, just swallow this, it's good for you, you don't really like the taste. If you keep doing that, after a while, people are going to spit it out. So there's some stuff that is only on the news because it's important and it's not interesting. And there's a continuum all the way to the things that are just kind of interesting and not important. And it's kind of like that meal analogy again. You try to put that together. And what's really important around those news tables is that you have diversity. Now, quite often when you hear diversity, it's a code word for people with different skin color. But diversity is about so much more than that. Yes, ethnic differences are important, but also it's where people are from. It's the kinds of jobs they have. It's their ages. You know, a 30-year-old mother on our news team brings to the table a lot of the same judgments as a 60-year-old single man, but also on certain issues, she has interest. I see it reflected every day in our meetings where people keep, even when it comes down to dogs. I don't have a dog, never will have a dog. Told my kids, you're going to have a lot of privileges in your house, but you're never going to have a dog. But, you know, against my better judgment, I work with people who have dogs. And they seem to care about stories involving dogs. And so, you know what? I get outvoted on the dog thing, and I accept that because we have diversity around our desk. Diversity in ways that you might not think. But it is important that you have those different points of view. And what's interesting is when you think about those different points of view at the newsroom, at Global National, and at CTV, and at CBC, and then you see at the end of the day the similarity of the decisions. You see it has more to do with news judgment than any other kind of outside, corrupting, negative influence. And so even though we make similar decisions, and then you might think, well, what's the point if everybody's making the same news decisions? They're made in different ways. I don't know which newscast you watch, and it's kind of like Chevrolet and Ford and Toyota, you know, from afar they all look like automobiles, but as you get closer, especially if you're a fan of one make as opposed to another, there's certain things about that particular company or a particular vehicle that attract you. Yes, we all started with the same stories last night, but we had Terry Malewski on one of our stories. And if you know Terry and you know the CBC, you know that's going to be different than the reporter who's presenting it for Global National. So we make a lot of the same decisions, we present it in a different way. And one of the things that I've seen at CBC in the long time that I've worked there is we went from a very BBC model where we were told to not ever show our feelings, never to be part of the story, never to share with the audience our experience in terms of gathering the stories. That was the old days. To now where we're told, you know what? You're a person, you're a human being. You can talk about how you feel. You still have to try to deliver the story in a fair and balanced way, but you can do it with a little bit of flavor, a little bit of personal perspective. And so that personal perspective makes the three newscasts, even when we're leading with the same story, it makes the three newscasts seem different. Last thing I want to talk about briefly, and I think it's a topic that will come up later in a different context, is what is currently an exaggeration of the impact of the internet and social media on mainstream media. Now, when I say this in some circles, people look at me and they kind of dismiss what I'm going to say for two reasons. First of all, I'm old, and so they play the age card. It's a very ugly thing. And they say, don't you dare do that, by the way. And so what they say to me is, you don't understand social media, of course, because, you know, you're an old guy. But then I play my age card back. It's a card I have in my vest pocket, pull it out. My kids, one of them is in university, the other one is in high school. So when I talk to the the 20-somethings that I work with, a lot of people sort of between the ages of 26 and 30 on my desk. Some of them, as I told you, unfortunately are dog owners as well, so 2 strikes against them. But they pretend to me that I don't understand what's happening with social media and the internet because of my age. But then I say, hey, you know what? My kids aren't on that site at all, and they're teenagers. So really, I think you're the one that's a little bit out of touch. When you say that to a 26-year-old, it absolutely rocks their world. They go, oh my God, I am old. I didn't realize that. I'm almost 30. So it's a card that I enjoy playing. The 2 things I would say quickly in my remaining time, I just have a couple of minutes, about the internet part of it. First of all, the business is changing. There's no question about that. We still get a lot of our information from screens, but it's not like the old days where there were 6 channels or 15 channels or 20 channels, where you would go to school or work the next day and there was a good chance that 25% of you, 1 in 4, had watched the same show the night before. Except for sports, except for Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals, or the Grey Cup, or the Olympics, we no longer have that experience. The audiences are fragmenting, absolutely. And you're just as likely to watch your show from a combination of the PVR or Netflix or your cable company on demand as you are to watch something live as we did in the old days. But the thing is, we're still watching things on screens. We're still reading words, just sometimes through a different medium. Not necessarily on paper, but you're still reading it. And there was a feeling about 10 years ago that citizen journalism was going to be the way of the future. What could be more beautiful than the unfiltered message of average people on the street who would just, yes, exactly. You're about a paragraph ahead of me. Is it up there? What could be better than the unfiltered message of people on the street sending you it directly without the mainstream media distorting that? Well, spend a little time on Twitter. Just look, maybe preferably not while I'm speaking, at what's trending now. Obviously, a filter is not necessarily a bad thing. There is a lot of noise out there. And so what's happening increasingly, I'll hear from people who will tell me they get all their news from Twitter. And when you start challenging them, you realize one of 2 things. Either their life does consist of 140-character views of naked guys in their basement, so yes, maybe they do get all their news from Twitter, but more likely what they're doing is they're getting notifications from mainstream news organizations, whether it's the Globe or CBC or what have you, and then that is directing them to either turn on the TV or go to their computer or smartphone and get more information. So mainstream media still does matter. I don't just say that because it's my employer. And what we have to do as consumers is just become as sophisticated as we ever were about understanding the sources of what we're getting, understanding the way we're getting that information. Yes, we live in a 24/7 news environment where there's intense pressure on people like me when you go to Calgary during the floods or Slave Lake during the fires, intense pressure not to wait till 10 p.m. to file for the National, but to do coverage right away. But that is never an excuse for being inaccurate. And when you think about it, we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. Long before, obviously, the internet, long before satellite trucks were putting microphones in the hands of reporters everywhere. But even that story, almost 50 years ago, was all about live news coverage. It was about, in its day, that 24/7 news cycle. And we all know 50 years later how extraordinary that coverage was, how measured it was, how appropriately emotional it was. And that's what we're doing so many years later. Thank you very much for your attention.